If you have been wanting to understand lighting and color, Stray is an extremely good resource. The game is full of amazing art direction, from the shabby props to the quirky robot characters, but I think the strongest part of Stray's visuals are in its lighting and color palette. Apart from, of course, Cat. My favorite element of its aesthetic is how the color choices really make an environment feel alive. Color theory doesn't have to be extremely hard to understand, and I'm going to be breaking down how it's used to create different moods in Stray. To understand how visuals affect us psychologically, we must first take a look at the context they're in. When we begin Stray, we're not immediately bombarded with all of the neon lighting and crazy cyberpunk colors that we see all over its screenshots and marketing material. Instead, the game starts off quiet and low-key, with soft, natural lighting. It's raining outside and the colors are mostly grey and blue, which eventually shift into warmer tones from all the direct light thanks to the sun. This is meant to feel like a safe haven and our home. There's also a lot of vegetation and plants that populate this area, and everything feels appropriately realistic and grounded. But this is all an elaborate setup for what happens next. After we get separated from the group, the mood and tone immediately shift into something creepier. Rather than the bright and inviting mood from the sun, the colors all shift towards dark blues and grays. It's very unsettling. This is a monochromatic color palette, which means there's only one major color being used. It kind of feels like this entire section takes place underwater, which is kind of fitting since we're now in an unfamiliar place all by ourselves, deep below. The reason this works is because of the immediate contrast with the bright natural colors just before. As players, we're able to compare the cozy safe environment just before with this eerie solitary one, and this makes us even more desperate to escape. The game could have started off blue and eerie from the beginning, but it wouldn't have had that same visual impact without using contrast. Monochromatic color palettes are extremely effective at creating very bold compositions. Since we're only using one color, what matters here are the values, which refers to how light or dark something is. For example, in this screenshot, everything in the foreground is much darker, while elements in the distance recede backwards, but they're all stemming from the same dark blue. There's also a lot of atmospheric fog, which helps to frame the cat on this metal beam. This would be way harder to see if the values in the back were just as dark. One of the things I really like in this opening section is how the city slowly comes to life as you continue exploring. It starts off with things like a light flickering, or a distant electrical hum. Signs start pointing the way. The city is trying to communicate with us. Now, out of all the colors that could have been chosen for this sign, why do you think the developers at Bluetail went with red? If you answered because it creates the most amount of contrast, then you are 100% correct. For example, if it was a blue sign, then it would still theoretically work at grabbing our attention because the entire sign would be the brightest thing in this environment. However, the issue is that it would really lack the emotional oomph that using red will bring. When we see red, we think of things like danger and attention and fire. Now, you may be already familiar with color theory and things like complementary colors that sit across the color wheel. That's not what's happening here, as the complementary of red isn't blue, but green. But still, this works because we're using two colors from opposite color temperatures. In this case, blue for cool and eerie, and red for attention and potentially danger. Another example we can see this popular palette being used is in John Wick, which also has a strong sense of that neon-soaked style. Now, let's take a look at an example in Stray where complementary colors are used. A little later in the game, we are sent into this section of the city that's infested with these Zerk enemies. In this section, the primary color being used is red, but as you can see in the background and with certain lights, green is also being used. So that leads to this question: why these specific colors? That's because the entire section is meant to feel hostile and dangerous to us. Red is a very effective color at conveying that. The use of green then is intentional because, as I mentioned, it creates extremely high contrast. This is extremely important in this section because the game developers need to funnel us as quickly as possible to our next objective. There's not a lot of exploring in this section compared to some of the other hubs that we see in Stray. Here, it's just point A to B and avoiding the Zerg enemies at all costs. If this section was monochromatic like the beginning of the game, it would feel extremely confusing to navigate while enemies are also chasing you. The colors here assist us in showing us where to go, even if we're not really aware of it consciously. The green sections here all take place outside of the boundaries and near the edge of the map, so we actually want to stay in the red zone. It also helps us to feel in control and we're able to navigate the level much faster. So, something you may have noticed is that there is some variation in the color palettes themselves. While the palettes are predominantly red and green or blue or whatever, there's plenty of examples of objects and colors breaking away from that palette. What's up with that? I'll show you more about how I actually approach this in my painting demo in part 2 of this video, but I'm going to address it here. The simplest reason for that is because in real life, not all colors fit the palette. Unless you're living in a room that's intentionally built to fit a single color, there is going to be variation wherever you go. As Stray is somewhat realistic in its graphical style, variation is important in making the environments feel believable. That's why you may see things like a yellow crane or an orange cone, even though the color palette is predominantly red and green. These are accented colors that can stray a little from the established palette, but for the most part, there is still a hierarchy it follows. If you want your art projects to feel believable but still designed, variation is the name of the game. I'd highly recommend breaking your palette just slightly to achieve it, just like Blue 12 did here. One of the main things I really love about Stray is that it's also not just hostility and gloom. The game's actually very cozy, with 2 places in particular standing out to me. The first is when you go to the ant village and find the sanctuary built into the side of a large silo. The colors here, like the beginning of the game, are much softer. There's a lot of natural tones from warmer browns and greens to cooler greys and blues. Notice how there's also a lot of natural elements. A waterfall, trees, exposed wood planks. It feels nice to be here. This also contrasts heavily with the previous sections of the game, which were much more industrial and oppressive. Now, check this out. When you reach the top, you come across this unique scene of Zalzabar's shrine. The warmer red tones and candlelit oranges all add to a feeling of relaxation, and that's been punctuated by the more artificial blues of the computer screens just behind it. What exists here is a harmony of different colors, and combined with the staging and prop design, creates a very visually pleasing area. The second extremely cozy place, and one you may have guessed if you've already played the game, is Clementine's apartment. The colors in this area are much stronger and saturated than the ant village, with more opportunities for drawing the eye and creating calming contrasts. The main color palette here is a complementary cyan and orange. Compared to the rest of the game, cyan is not used very often, and so this immediately stands out to us. Though the cool thing I want to point out about the lighting in Clem's apartment is that there's a lot more colors being used. For example, the bathroom consists of blue and purple, and the palette also shifts to orange and blue where Clem is standing. All of these create distinct visual zones, which allow us to flow through them and gives variety to the apartment. The colors here also act as a kind of microcosm for the entire Midtown section, where cyan is used on the outside and in the atmosphere, and warmer tones are used to populate everything within. Again, we have that foreground and background separation through just using different colors. Even the accented purples and blues can still be found throughout the various billboards. This is known as a triadic color scheme, where there is a main or dominant color and 2 accents spaced equally on the color wheel. In this case, it's cyan, orange, and purple. This also kind of reminds me of the original BioShock, where the ocean was a sickly cyan and everything else in Rapture was dark blue and orange. So with all of that theory out of the way, in my next video I'm going to be showing how I actually painted color studies from Stray. Now, I believe learning and theory are one thing, but actually putting in the time to practice will really skyrocket your skills as an artist. I'm going to be explaining how I approach color studies, from choosing the right colors to making sure your values stayed up, and all of this is so you don't have to have all the headache and pressure when it comes to practicing. Thank you for watching, everyone. I hope this was helpful, and until next time, take care and stay safe.